Hey everyone, welcome to the PlexTrac mini-series. This episode will feature a discussion on red teaming exercises and features none other than our very own Tyler Robinson. You can learn more by visiting securityweekly.com/PlexTrac series. Welcome everyone to the PlexTrac podcast series, Getting the Real Work Done in Cybersecurity. I'm Paul Sidorian from Security Weekly. I like how we said starring. This episode will be starring Dan DeClaus, from CEO and founder at PlexTrac. Dan, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Paul. I feel so famous.
Right? We'll make you a star, Dan. In a very small group of people. Sean Scott, the VP of Success at PlexTrac, is here with us. Welcome, Sean.
Thanks. So happy to be back, Paul.
Our VP of Success, our very own Tyler Robinson, of course, Security Weekly host and Offensive Security Director at Trimark Security, is here with us. Tyler, welcome.
Thanks. This starring and VP stuff has just got me wondering.
I know, and it's almost like you have to act like a responsible adult now, but we'll keep it lighthearted as always here at Security Weekly. We're talking about red teaming and the pitfalls to getting the real work done when you're performing a red team assessment. Dan, I want to turn it over to you to talk about red teaming, because I think it was probably one of the original concepts where we had to generate some data, find ways to get in and collect that and get some actionable results. It's certainly one of the oldest activities. We've got Security Weekly hosts that were doing pen testing way back in the days of DoD, before many of us maybe even got into the field. So, this is a tried and true method that has been used for some time. I'll turn it over to you to kind of see where that fits into PlexTrac and how you're helping customers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thanks. Red teaming and penetration testing has been around for a long time, right? And it's that notion of not only can I find a vulnerability in an organization or a website or from a physical perspective, but can I actually exploit those vulnerabilities to get into the environment and actually achieve some kind of mission or some kind of goal? And as the security community has grown and the industry has evolved, and obviously, for those of us that have been in the Department of Defense early on in our careers, this has been part of the activities all along. But we've really seen the notion and continue to grow and mature in private enterprise, right? And so now here we are in 2021, and it's an actual job. It's an actual profession that people are getting paid quite a bit of money to go do, right? And it requires a unique skill set that does take time to hone, right? I think that there's a lot of tactics and techniques that really just take time to develop as a seasoned penetration tester.
Yeah, it seemed easier back in the day, right? When we could just telnet or FTP and maybe guess a password, and then we were in and maybe exploit a vulnerability that we found on Millworm or something. It seemed way easier back in the day.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, so I mean, like everything, we have to really, continue to understand, how technology moves and grows. And I think one thing that's important that penetration testers don't get a lot of credit for is just how much they have to know about everything, and the true notion of being a hacker is really to, get to the root of how things work. And so being a technologist, there's not necessarily in the pen testing community, the notion of I know this one specific thing very, very well and can do it very, very well. I mean, you might have specialties, but at the whole, you have to know a lot about a lot of technologies when you go into an engagement. And I think where the industry needs to continue to progress and is stay more focused on how are we helping the organizations that we're testing be more secure, right? And helping them learn those tactics and techniques that are ever evolving, ever growing, to make sure that we're all achieving the same goals and the same missions as part of the team that's propelling the security posture forward.
Dan, it's interesting. I've talked with, sorry, Tyler, I'm really excited about this point. But I've talked to a lot of hackers, right, in the past 15 years, and I realized I've been a hacker my entire life. Maybe I didn't realize that until a certain point in my career. And one of the qualities or traits that you mentioned, Dan, of a hacker, and to your point where red teamers don't maybe get enough credit, is that ability to identify a subject matter that could be technology or even outside of technology, like lockpicking or social engineering, right? Identify a technology or some aspect of it, and it's something you have no idea about. You've never seen that before. To be able to read and research and come up to speed on that quickly enough to be able to leverage it to be able to get into an organization or point out vulnerabilities is such a quality of a great hacker, right? And then as I interview folks, I'm like, I had noticed that trend that they were like, well, I started researching this because I was interested in it, or I had it. Maybe it was attached to my body. Maybe it was a vehicle that I got in, but I got curious and came up to speed on it enough to be able to point out vulnerabilities. Tyler, you're certainly 1,000% in that camp. I think like literally in an afternoon, you've come back to me and, I didn't know about that, but now like I know enough to break it, right?
Yeah, it does take that certain level of curiosity and tenacity to want to understand whatever it is you're looking at. And maybe you don't even want to understand it. Like there's necessity. We've talked at length about some of the COVID stuff and just virology in general and epidemiology and the necessity to understand that to make informed decisions. So yeah, that's a characteristic for sure. And around like the red team aspect of that, I think there are a lot of good places. We've come to a place in the industry where we've started to identify and really get that term under control. Initially, this term was thrown around and everybody was doing red teaming all of a sudden. It was just a hot new thing. So basically pen tests were all red teams and it was a stealthy pen test of some kind. But really getting the understanding of when and how to use red teaming to an organization's advantage becomes much more integral. And I think we're starting to get to the point where we are making strides there. Because if you don't understand the organization, you don't understand the business, you don't understand the risks, you as the offensive person can't come up with a good mission or objective to comprehensively test an organization in a meaningful manner. Yeah, we can, be stealthy all day. We can destroy a blue team and get into most places with a full scope, pen test. But that doesn't do most organizations a good job. So really coming up with very strategic and thought laid out objectives and missions, a very goal-oriented pen test, for lack of a better word, that right there is what encompasses what a red team needs to be. And like I said, there was a lot of misnomers around this in the beginning, and everyone was just doing stealthy pen tests or just destroying everything and calling it a pen test, or putting, phishing in scope and calling it a red team. So I think we've gotten to a better place, but I still think there's a lot of understanding, like Dan was saying. We really need to get the objective and the goals for an organization in order to help them more efficiently. That's the real goal of a red team, is to be the best that we can be at the level at which that organization will benefit.
And just to speak to those goals, what I really love is that we use our hacker skills of coming up to speed on something to the advantage of the organization we're testing. Because often I found the organization goes, I don't think anyone would really spend that much time to be able to hack into that stuff. Like, why would anyone do that? And it's like, well, the hackers are the ones that would actually do that, right? And then after the red teaming exercise, they're like, oh, that's how it would work. You could theorize about it all day long, but until someone spends that time to reverse engineer the firmware on this really esoteric device that they're like, no one knows about these, no one would ever do that. Well, no, people would. I think that's a good value.
Yeah, you definitely want to know what's on that gene printer.
Yeah. Sean?
Yeah, I actually wanted to explore a little bit more about what Tyler was talking about the importance and the value, and really setting those objectives up front. And really, it was more of a question back at Tyler, because in my experience, oftentimes when an organization engages another organization to come and perform services, red team services, straight stealthy pen test, they really don't know what to ask for. And, so how do we as information security practitioners, in a concise fashion, without throwing a bunch of extra hours on the statement of work, help guide them to the proper objectives and come upon some shared objectives that are going to be of value to them?
I think the first part there, and the part that has been missing in a lot of places, is a good line of communication and articulation. Our job as the offensive consultants that are coming in is to understand and articulate what the business risk is. And in order to do that, we have to effectively communicate different aspects or avenues of what we think the business is and what an attacker might consider valuable there. But that open line of communication has to be two ways. If the business unit's maybe have things that we wouldn't consider valuable, but they consider valuable. We need to understand those. I don't fully understand every business vertical out there in the world. And so really understanding, here's what I think an attacker would go after based on these characteristics. Now let's chat about that, have that open line of communication. That's really where the value of good dialogue and the good initial like scoping and kickoff call come into play, is really understanding what the business line is, what's valuable, how do they make money, what things would be a game stopper for them if it was either compromised, breached, or unavailable, and then laying out kind of the offensive or attacker's objectives around those particular things.
So I think a takeaway from that, Tyler, is that really a lot of the value that they're going to derive out of the offensive engagement is going to be a direct function of how transparent they are about the things that are of value to them, and potentially also what's happened to them in the past. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And that's one of the areas that you can actually improve and gain a lot of efficiency out of from a red team standpoint is, yeah, there are engagements where it makes sense to conduct an engagement fully black box, fully blind, like come at us, see what we can do. Let's measure our blue team's defensive capabilities and mitigation strategies. Great. That's one way. That's a very mature organization. You're talking about probably a 5 to 10% of companies that are ready to do that kind of work. The other way, and the way you gain efficiency, is really taking those time-intensive activities and get an understanding of, does that provide value in our organization, or can we skip and assume that, hey, we don't have these mitigating controls in place for phishing, and we don't have a good security awareness program. We don't have all of these things in place. So let's assume that someone's going to phish and be successful. Let's start there and forego a lot of the time-intensive and expensive activities to then see what our defensive capabilities are after that breach and what our visibility levels are from there. So that continuing conversation of really understanding your organization, understanding from an offensive standpoint, giving them the value of, here are some scenarios, here's some ways that we can save money and time, and here's some things and assumptions that we can do in order to make this a much more successful environment. If really they only have 10 high-value targets and the data is very, very specific to their organization and the rest of it is just a function of business, then really understanding, hey, why don't we forego that? Assume that we can get all the way to DA in this one environment, and we're at the point where we're trying to jump into the secure environment. Let's start there and avoid all of the time-intense mistakes that may be made, or the detection points that you may or may not have. Let's assume you don't, and focus on the high-value targets and figure out what the objective should be from there. If there's time left over, we can circle back and then work through the mitigating controls that may have gotten to that point.
I've got a question on how you balance the scoping, and it's interesting that I don't think I've thought about it this way before. And we spent a lot of time talking about red teaming and pen testing over the years. It sounds like you have to balance your business objectives and things that are important to the business with your security solutions and your security processes with the technologies that you use. In other words, to start a pen test and go, well, I just want you to go after the crown jewels is one thing. To say, well, we use Microsoft Teams and, we want to know how secure that is. Or I've got this security solution, XYZ. We could go through every letter of the alphabet 15 times over, and I want to see the effectiveness of this. It's really a combination of all those things, it sounds like, when we're talking about a red team engagement. Correct?
Correct. And you're testing each one of those and really understanding where the value lies. Again, this is your job as the offensive side of this, is to really understand the level of risk from each individual component within inside of that. You've got the business, you've got the technology, and you've got the mitigating controls and compensation. So each one of those, we've talked about this before, is things like SaaS, right? Like things like Teams or Slack. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, maybe there's not a ton of proprietary data in there, or PII, or whatever vertical you're in. However, there's all the keys and codes and GitHub access and links and snippets of code that are all being shared across something like Teams or Slack or GitHub. And if that one SaaS application is compromised, or a single sign-on for an individual user is compromised, what happens then and how much access can you get? So really taking a holistic look at all of the technologies you're leveraging, how they fall into the business units, and not just what data lives where, but what accesses or what information is needed in order to potentially get to that point or cause damage to the organization. And these SaaS applications are one great example of a good goal for an objective red team. If someone compromises our SaaS applications or single sign-on, what is the ramifications? Do we have detection means in place in the cloud or on any of these applications to detect and mitigate? And then what is our response and capability to respond to these type of attacks with inside of something like cloud or SaaS?
Yeah, it's interesting. It almost goes beyond risk in what's our ability to respond, right? Which I guess is a component of risk, but really covering all those bases of probability, impact, our ability to respond.
Yeah, it seems like, like where we're kind of, we haven't like necessarily explicitly stated it, but, what we're talking about is like, what defines success for this engagement, right? And really having a more collaborative nature in helping the organization mature. Some people may start out like, hey, I just want complete black box. Don't tell me what you're doing or when you're starting. And we want to see if we can detect it. And then, you come back in 6 months or whatever and deliver your report and drop all the findings in. But, I would say that a more mature organization is gonna methodically walk through the process, right? Of hey, for this engagement, these are the things that we want to define success to be, right? We really want to test. Do we have a C2 potential, a potential C2 channel through our Slack or Teams, those kinds of things, and having a way to really methodically work through all the different goals that you might have, because a blanket large engagement, yeah, you may be able to cover a lot of those things, but you're not going to necessarily get the deep and the depth that you might desire as you continue to grow. Would you agree, Tyler? Or what have you seen as in terms of how do you define success?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that becomes a real difficult aspect from a red team standpoint, red team specific standpoint, right? Because you run into a couple different things. You run into does the organization understand their risk and do they have buy-in from, the top down? If they don't have that, then your ability to do a successful engagement really kind of hinges on your ability to be stealthy, not get caught, and your starting point optics then becomes very important, because a top-down leader is going to say, well, you gave them access into our environment, so therefore none of this counts. If they didn't have access, none of this would have happened. So you really have to understand, what the buy-in and what the organization's maturity level is. And then additionally, you also have to check the ego of the red team and the company coming in. Are they able to be very collaborative and work close with the blue team and provide all the defensive mechanisms, provide all the TTPs? If that answer is no, then and they want to just go at it full hammer and not get caught, that's not going to provide very much value for most companies. Again, we're talking 5% maybe where you might see value in that for very specific objectives and to prove defensive capabilities. Otherwise, you're not going to get value. You're going to be stealthy. You're going to destroy them. You're going to get most of the objectives, if not all of them. And the red team's going to be successful, but the blue team's going to be left with, hey, we just got wrecked, and now what? So in order for it to be successful, really the best case scenario is a very clear and open dialogue and communication channel where you lay out what success looks like for each objective, and hopefully you have multiple objectives and counter operations that, if this happens and you guys do detect us, are we going to move on? Are we going to try and start back at the beginning? So having some of that organization and plan laid out in advance is very important. And then really understanding, if you do get to a point or an objective, what is kind of the next play and how can we help further succeed this? Is that helping them with their visibility? Is that helping them with their response? Is that helping them just with their policies and procedures around what to do once they see some of these things? And so being very clear around how the success happens, but putting that success in the lap of the blue team is the most important thing. And that's where we see a lot of red teams fail. And that's why red teams got a pretty bad rap for a while, is because the ego side of a red team, I want to go in and destroy, be stealthy, and just do all the things, which is cool, but that does not usually help organizations. And if we're going to make this stick and we're going to have an impact on the world, as red teams and we want to keep doing this, then we need to be very specific about how we're helping the organization and what those successes look like for them, not for us.
And I think
so. I mean, go ahead.
I was just going to say making smaller chunks of work and understanding the different pieces, because you're doing a red team, right? It's against the whole organization. You're going to have a lot of findings, and I think that's one of the things that almost hurts red teaming is they're like, you can get in that situation that you've kind of mentioned already, where the blue team's kind of depressed and they're like, I don't know what to do, and they can throw their arms up and go, I'm not just going to do anything. It's one reason why I like the product. I don't want to be too product specific too early on, right? But it's because it can break it up into those smaller chunks. And I have a story about that. But Dan, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I think you hit it on the head. Is like, not getting to the point where you just feel so overwhelmed. They're like, what's the point? Why, I know I'm going to get owned. There's no point in paying somebody lots of money to come and pen test us when we just know what they're going to achieve.
Right.
And so I think, having that red team come alongside and say, no, this is why, and this is the methodology that we take and staying, in that collaborative, sticky approach, right. From the red team's perspective with your customers, or even, if you're an internal red team, staying in a defined methodology and process of like, this is the growth plan, so to speak, right? It's not just a, hey, we're going to come in every year and do this, and we're going to own you and find all the new tips and tricks of how to break your defenses, but really laying out a methodical plan and being able to track that over time is really where it is important, and I think where the industry is continuing to mature and recognize how much more valuable that component to red teaming truly is.
And I think, Dan, that there's an additional factor other than time and budget that needs to go into any scoping conversation, and that is the bandwidth and capacity of the blue team to actually do something with the findings, because it is demoralizing when you get crushed with more things than that you're ever going to have budget, you're ever going to have time to fix. So how do you keep people engaged in the process? How do you keep them coming back? How do you make offensive security successful and get the buy-in you need? Is ensuring that whatever comes out of it, no matter how much you paid for it, is in a package that's right-sized for the maturity of the organization to actually do something with that.
Yeah, it's interesting, the combination of understanding a threat and accepting the risk of that threat is, I think, a thing in the blue team. And as we've said, blue teams are really busy. It's a lot of work to manage Active Directory, as an example. And I was in a position at one time in my career where I had a great working relationship with our Active Directory team, thankfully. And I was like, this is at a time when RDP was not at the place where RDP is today. And I was like, you're using that to manage the entire infrastructure that they had like really just built in the past couple of years. This is in like early 2000s. And I said, there's a risk there. There's a threat. I can sniff your password. And he was like, no. He's like, no, but it comes from, and this is part of the problem, right? It comes from Microsoft. We're using it, and I read the documentation, and I'm using it the way it is, and I accept the risk. And I'm like, well, what if I could show you? And since we had a great working relationship, he was like, yeah, I want to see that. So I put together a little demo, and I showed him that I could basically sniff my own. I used my own, password to do that, and he had given me access to systems as well. I was actually helping him build some of the infrastructure, and I was like, "Here it is." He's like, "Whoa, we need to fix that," and immediately went off and fixed it. Right, and there's a lot of value that comes from that, and this speaks to the value of a red team is helping blue teams understand the impact of risk. Right, but what I also realized in this conversation, that's a very small, just one chunk and very small scope. And you really need a platform and a process to be able to track all of the findings, prioritize them, and get everyone on board, right? And maybe for this project, didn't have to go request time from management because it was something he could fix more easily. But that, as we know, isn't always the case.
Yeah, and then having the perspective of making growth and progress over time, starts to make you feel better about yourself, right? It's like, hey, you don't lose weight by never checking the scale. You check the scale every day to say like, hey, I am actually losing pounds every week, right? And so when you have a platform, like PlexTrac, to be able to track your progress and show like, hey, we were really bad, right? And I think one nice thing that's coming out of more red team engagements is this adoption of not just identifying the findings, but also identifying the activities and tactics and techniques that occurred during the assessment, right? So that you can say like, hey, when we first started, we conducted 5 activities and all of them succeeded, right? And that's how we owned you. Hey, this last time, yeah, we still got domain admin, we still achieved the goal of getting into the crown jewels, but it took us this many more attempts, right? It took us this much more time, and it took us this much more effort. And by the way, your blue team actually picked up on some of those activities to where, had this been a true incident, or if they just tweaked some of their IR process, they would have been able to stop the exfiltration. So I think having something like PlexTrac to be able to show like we've made progress over time really starts to improve the morale, as opposed to just like, well, why bother, right? We know what's going to happen, and then so there's not even worry about it.
The ability to have metrics in general, especially from a red team standpoint, right? Like you're usually delivered a report in Word doc or PDF format. If it's just a report, it's stored on some file share somewhere. It's kind of out of sight, out of mind. You've got an idea of some findings to work on. Some of those may take 6 months. They may take a year. That really becomes difficult, like you said, to measure and articulate and really understand what the prioritization and what the findings actually are. Are you covering down on behavior? Are you covering down on an individual tactic? And that becomes really important for blue teams, is to understand from a high level, are we covering and either addressing each one of those, and what was our metric from the prior year, and how are we improving from a behavior standpoint or a high level standpoint versus a single tactic. And that's really hard to do just with a paper report finding. And oftentimes it's coming from multiple companies. Most places will switch companies, every other year, every 2 years. And so the ability for you to take someone's report, look at the findings, and then correlate the same kind of data and metrics from where you were last time, and maybe not even get the same findings, that becomes very hard to measure from a blue team standpoint for their ongoing success. And so something like PlexTrac provides that, not only from a metrics and visibility standpoint, but it almost provides a to-do list of prioritizations year over year for everyone to be measured by the same objective kind of outlook. And I think that's a really important key that needs to be addressed, and it's something that we as an offensive industry haven't done a great job in the past, kind of comparing and correlating where people exist and how much better they've gotten.
Also the rich media that you can associate with it. In my example, it was a one-on-one demo. In the PlexTrac example, and one of the reasons I brought it up is that would be a screencast movie. Now it's not just sitting on some file share, to Tyler's point, right? It's part of that finding that can be referenced and tracked. And these are the types of systems that I like to work with, because we get into these disparate systems and the message can get lost. Now all of the administrators of Active Directory can go look at that one finding, and everyone can go look at that screencast movie. I think that's extremely valuable.
We've been doing a lot of talking about, about findings and, vulnerabilities and things that need to be fixed over time. One of the things that we're really focusing on in 2021 at PlexTrac is how do we allow the red teams and the offensive security efforts to better validate and form the resource decisions that security organizations are making, because it's not necessarily just about finding the things that are wrong, but it's about demonstrating the value that's coming from those things that you have in place that you've paid for. Is the thing that I purchased in last year's budget actually doing the things that I want to do? And the red team's function, is not just about finding where are the holes, but also where's the coverage.
Yeah, what is the value or return on investment for particular products or vendors, like ongoing service, MSPs that monitor the network? Is there value there? Are they doing what we're paying them to do contractually? And could there be room for improvement to either educate and train them to do a better job, or to look for alternate vendors? Those are really good use cases for red teams that's their function, is to test and help the blue team understand what their capabilities are, what level they're operating at, and are things working the way they should be. Oftentimes, most of the tools we see, there's great tools in the industry. Most of the time, it's a tuning issue. They've not tuned or configured those because of a lack of knowledge around the tuning, because vendors are not great at tuning them either. They want things to just work. Or B, they've not taken the time or don't have the resources and knowledge to go ahead and tune those themselves. And so I think really getting that return on investment, not just from identifying those holes and the gaps there, but really getting your money's worth out of the products that you currently have already paid for, and they just need to be properly configured and tuned for the capability that they have. And so I think that's an important aspect of really getting your value out of a red team and understanding, where the risk and where the value is coming from in your organization and where you're putting your resources, time, and money. And the other part is, not to tout PlexTrac too much because I do love the product a ton, but really we are in 2021, and the fact that we're still delivering crap-looking freaking Word docs or PDFs that are half-assed, with half a page of recommendation that you got to scroll through and it's old content or out of date. Like the ability to have dynamic content, show things like videos or images in a reactive way, and be able to interact with that and build a plan around a finding or some kind of a metric. That's how we should be reporting. This is 2021. We don't need to go back to 1999 where we've been doing the same kind of reporting forever. This has been a yell that I've been just trying to figure out how to do this. How can we deliver something that is tangible to a customer because they want a deliverable? They paid a lot of money for it. But how can we deliver something that is much more efficient and dynamic for them? Something like a web page, a website, or like PlexTrac, you've got a portal that allows you to deliver some dynamic content that provides much more value than just a single printable PDF. Like we're way past that. We need to move past that.
Yeah, and I think another important piece is continuing to facilitate the collaboration between the different teams. Like I'll ask you a question, Tyler. Being predominantly in your career an external red teamer, when do organizations really need to invest in having some of those internal red teaming capabilities, whether that's a person or another automated platform or things like that that are helping do those in a more continuous fashion. Because the way I kind of view it is like it's a next step in your maturity, regardless of how big you are. But then having that external red team really collaborate with the internal red team and blue team to be able to say like, hey, these are the things that we're seeing on a routine basis across all of our clients. Because there's a lot of value there to have that perspective of multiple different environments, multiple different customers, and then being able to provide that insight to those internal teams. And so being able to collaborate through a platform like PlexTrac on those types of tactics and techniques and helping put the context into the internal red team. Have you seen that happening, as we've grown in an industry?
I've not seen it as much as I would like to see it. This is one of the areas that, again, it's really frustrating because I would love to change how an engagement plays out. When we start to facilitate an engagement, talk to a customer, we really tell them that we want a long-term relationship. Otherwise, this doesn't really value it doesn't value my time, and it doesn't benefit you as much as it could. The reason that is because like you said, you're exactly right. The ability for an internal team to go back, make remediation steps against findings, and not be able to test them until a complete year later when the threat landscape, the environment, the organization has changed. That validation piece then becomes very difficult. They don't have a communication channel with the red team. Sometimes you can get them on email. They're very busy. They're on the next engagement. Really having a collaborative platform where you can ask a question very specifically around something that was found, and then work through that with an organization and build that long-term relationship so that they are comfortable. They have a trusted security advisor. They have a communication channel. They have validation steps that can be performed in order to see if what they're doing is actually working. Those are something that we always try and include in our reports is the validation step. Here, you can go reproduce this yourself in a very controlled manner. And we encourage people to be able to do that because if they don't have that ability themselves, they're not going to effectively be able to test. Oftentimes, from a blue team standpoint, when we've implemented technologies, you think about how difficult it is just to get it to work, much less validating that security controls are in place and working and the functionality of the app is working. And so really getting that validation piece and having an open collaboration platform becomes very important. I think that is the next evolution of how red teams and how engagement should go. Maybe you don't have an internal red team because you're not big enough, you don't have enough resources or money. but you have a trusted security advisor, you have a trusted company, you have a trusted red team, and a collaborative platform in order to engage their knowledge and work with them on an ongoing basis to further the security. Yeah, you may do a single engagement once a year where you're hammering out and trying to really test the efficiencies of what you've done, but throughout the rest of the year, as you're implementing and fixing findings, you're working with them and prioritizing and reevaluating and validating that whatever you're doing is then being changed. And so this becomes an ongoing relationship between offensive teams, offensive consultancies, and the internal, maybe they do have an offensive person or a security team or just a blue team. That communication line and collaboration platform and ongoing testing nature really does need to become a priority within inside of our industry.
Dan, any product specific things that you want to mention in our conversation? We covered red teaming in multiple different aspects. Maybe perhaps for Sean, when you're doing a traditional red team engagement, whether you're on the red team or the blue team, what are some of the major value points versus using PlexTrac versus not using PlexTrac? And to Tyler's point, having static files and reports that just get left on a file share somewhere and no one's looking at them.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I find that, and obviously I'm not doing red team engagements myself right now. I'm supporting people who are out there in the trenches doing those things, but we work very collaboratively together. But one of the things that I see more often than I've ever seen in the past with our partners who are actively using PlexTrac and doing that and taking advantage of the collaborative nature is that I'm seeing more findings that are in process or complete by the time the report's actually written. And the reason is because we're buying ourselves time. As the offensive security team has identified things, it's documented, it's there. How did we do the thing? And there's oftentimes when not only has an issue been remediated, but it's been retested because that cycle was able to be completed within the period of time in the scope of work. The red team was still on contract. We still had hours. We still had time. If we had questions about things, we didn't have to go try to establish communications with an external agency that has moved on to their next engagement. So having the real-time ability to have visibility and collaboration is really one of the ways that I see that red teaming has really benefited from using a platform like PlexTrac, and how not just our partners who are users of PlexTrac, but their partners are really deriving more value than they have through past ways of doing business.
Yeah, and I think the ability to continue to be able to document your procedures that you're executing during the engagement, through PlexTrac, our runbooks module, are really, starting to show a lot of value to the end users and the constituent teams that are responsible for fixing those items, is that they can not only see hey, this is actually really valuable stuff, and I'm learning a lot from what the red team is doing, and also identifying how difficult it has been for them to, how difficult or easy, I guess, it has been for them to actually exploit our environment and get into the deeper nuances of the Active Directory system or the databases that they were targeting. So that's definitely an important piece of the puzzle that our customers are really finding value out of, and in tandem with that, the analytics of showing your progress over time, like Sean was mentioning, and being able to show that in practically real time. Before the engagement's actually completed, you've been able to collaborate on those high important issues that are being found, and have that remediation life cycle drastically reduced in terms of time and average time to remediation. So being able to track that effectively has been a huge win for people using PlexTrac. It's now we have an accurate view of our average time to remediation, as well as an easy way to report these issues, right? I think normalizing and standardizing the way in which findings get reported out of security assessments in general is what our mission was. One of our missions, right, is to make sure that these items and risks look the same, regardless of their source, so that we can all talk and treat them in a manner that's worthy of the what impact it has to the business.
It sounds like you're bringing efficiencies to both the red and blue team in this example, right? That the report writing, But also some of the methodology in playbooks can be specific to red teams, making them more efficient. The blue team is more efficient because they can access the findings and track remediation much more efficiently. So that's efficiency on both sides of it, which is a huge value, no?
Yeah, I mean, our mission is to keep the security practitioners focused on getting the real work done. Kind of the theme of this mini series. But that there's a lot of time that can get wasted and focus be shifted from where it really needs to be. And when you talk about a security professional's time, that time is worth a lot of money, right? And not only from what you're paying them, but from where their focus should be with respect to the business risk, right? If they're spending more time on the things that don't actually help improve the risk posture, then not only is it their wasted money that you're paying them on a salary basis, but it's also an opportunity cost, at the business. And so, improving efficiencies, enhancing their workflows, being able to help them communicate things faster so that they can stay focused on what they, are hired to do, is really our goal.
And that opportunity cost is a really great example of not just an opportunity cost of you getting or having a red team come in, right? The opportunity cost of where that red teamer is having to spend time writing reports. I'm a very expensive copy editor. I'm a very expensive Word document wordsmith. It is something we've had to learn how to do, and it's something that's been a huge focus inside of the security industry for a while, being able to technically write and articulate and generate beautiful Word documents.
Yeah.
If you can eliminate a lot of that time spent, that puts that operational loss or efficiency loss back into an organization that may be an external organization. Maybe you are the organization being tested from a third-party consultancy. If you have PlexTrac, I encourage you to find a way to work with your offensive consultancy team and have them utilize your platform so that they see the value. You take away the time loss that they're spending on generating all these reports, and you're really normalizing and making efficient the things that are a time suck that really don't add a ton of value. Great. I have a really professional looking report. That's what's expected because I'm a consultancy and I should be delivering that because that's what you pay for. But really what you pay for is my knowledge and my ability to break your network. So that operational cost of making a really nice looking document, if you take that out, you're going to get a lot better tests. You're going to have a lot more time to utilize and focus on the things, get a much more comprehensive look at your business risk, and maybe have opportunity savings where you're able to communicate and add value and work with the offensive teams to really start to bring some remediation or some light around things that you wouldn't have had time to test. And so I think there's a ton of opportunity cost savings that can be capitalized on from any of these platforms, whether you're the organization being tested and you have Plex within inside of your environment, or you're the offensive team. Show them how you're doing your reporting, invite them to collaborate, bring a client in and help them understand what metrics they have and where they can actually save and normalize some of these findings and prioritize some of the findings that they're getting. So there's opportunity on both sides of this to regain those costs.
That's well said, Tyler. I want to thank Dan, Sean, and Tyler for appearing on this episode. Great discussion. Thank you all.
Hey, thanks, Paul. Thanks a bunch. Thanks, Tyler.
See you guys.
Seeing you again.